If you've seen it, I think you would agree with me that the scene in today's gospel is very beautifully captured in that season, The Chosen. So if you haven't seen that, go back and look it up. It's one in the earlier seasons. But if this man, Simon, later called Peter, knew anything, it was about fishing on the lake of Gennesaret, otherwise known as the Sea of Galilee. Fishing was done with nets, not with lines, and it was done at night as it still is to this very day, so that the fish would be less likely to see the trap that is set for them. So in this passage, when we see Simon and his co-workers on the shore cleaning their nets, they are not beginning their workday in the morning, rather they're ending it. They are not only tired, but they are discouraged, we are told, because as we learn, after a whole night of trying, they caught absolutely nothing. So when this newcomer to the town of Capernaum, who admittedly is intriguing in his words and rather amazing in his healing powers, who has attracted a crowd along the shore that morning, asks to borrow Simon's boat as a pulpit of sorts, maybe Simon was just too exhausted to say no. And so, presumably, he lets Jesus into the boat, and then he himself rows it out a short distance from the shore, so that creating an amphitheater of sorts, Jesus would be heard. And you can go to that harbor to this very day, called the Harbor of the Apostles. Yet when Jesus is finished instructing the people who gathered to listen to him, he then instructs Simon to do something that he knows better than to do, which is to put out into the deep and drop his net one more time. The nets, we know, have been cleaned already. Simon and his co-workers are tired and anxious to get home for breakfast and then for a day of rest before having to head out again to fish at nightfall. And besides, in Simon's experience, if the fish aren't being fooled at night, certainly they won't be in the day when they can see the net. So maybe with some grumbling, at least in thought, if not word, Simon does what makes him actually look rather ridiculous in the eyes of his partners and co-workers. He does what Jesus says, yet when he does, to his great amazement and that of everyone present, the net is miraculously filled with fish to bursting. So in the face of what seemed quite improbable, if not absolutely impossible, Simon realizes he is in the presence of no ordinary man. And like someone who shows up at a formal affair in casual clothes, he becomes acutely aware of his unworthiness, of being out of place. And so he humbles himself before Jesus, who instead of saying, "See, Simon, I told you so," instead invites him to remain in his company and to join him in his work, which is to capture people for God's kingdom. So Simon and his brother Andrew and his partners James and John give testimony to the persuasive power of Jesus as they give up their very livelihood to then follow him as disciples. So this passage on the call and response of Simon and the first disciples is to be a lesson in discipleship to us as well. If we would stop and contemplate the holiness of Jesus, then without exception, we will appreciate that we are unworthy to be in his presence and remain in his company. But like Simon, we have to respond to his call anyway, trusting that even though we are certainly sinners, Jesus still can and in fact actually desires to make us agents of good for the sake of his kingdom. And like Simon, through our own experiences and maybe a bit of pride on our part, we may at times think that we somehow know better than Jesus what should or shouldn't be done. And to do what Jesus asks might run the risk of making us look foolish in the eyes of other people. But like Simon, we must learn to trust and thus to do what Jesus asks anyway. For only then are we also likely to witness the seemingly impossible at times accomplished. When later at Caesarea Philippi, in response to a question from Jesus as to whom the disciples thought he really might be, Simon confessed his faith that Jesus is truly the Son of the living God. At that, Jesus changed his name to Peter, because he would then be the rock on which the future church was to be built. Today, Jesus still teaches from the boat that is captained by Peter's successor. And this vessel is certainly not a cruise ship by any means, nor even a fishing trawler, as much as it is in fact a rescue boat. Thus, those of us on board are not meant to be passengers as much as we are supposed to be part of the crew. And our task is the same as that of the first disciples, which is to catch people alive, as the particular word Jesus uses for fishing implies. That is, alive before they perish in the rough seas of life outside the boat. So as disciples, let us follow Peter's lead and learn not to waste time questioning our own worthiness or doubting our own ability to do what it is that Jesus might be asking each of us in a particular way to do, but simply trust that if we would obey as Peter did, Jesus can and still will accomplish nearly impossible things through our humble and maybe even at times bumbling cooperation.